Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the English Globe. And we are truly happy that you have joined us today for another long, calm, and beginner-friendly English learning podcast, because this channel is created especially for learners who want to improve their listening skills step by step, while also understanding important global news in simple English. And in today's episode, Julia and I will explore a very serious and widely discussed international topic, which is the Ukraine-Russia peace talks, and more importantly, we will explain why so many people around the world expected these talks to bring progress, why no final deal was reached, and how understanding this issue can help English learners feel more confident when listening to international media without feeling lost or overwhelmed.
Thank you, Adam, and hello to everyone listening from different parts of the world. And I am really glad we are talking about this topic today because many English learners see these headlines every day, but often feel confused by the long sentences and complex vocabulary used in the news. And as Adam mentioned, this podcast is completely educational and neutral. And we are not here to support any political side, but instead to explain what peace talks are, why they matter globally, and why the failure to reach a deal surprised many observers. And while we talk, you will hear useful English expressions such as ceasefire, negotiations, diplomatic efforts, security concerns, and international mediation, which are very common in global news reports.
When the words peace talks appear in headlines, people naturally feel hopeful, because the idea of dialogue suggests that violence might stop and that solutions might be found through discussion instead of force. And this is exactly why the world paid close attention when Ukraine and Russia agreed to sit down and talk. Because for many months, the conflict had affected not only these two countries, but also global food prices, energy markets, and international security discussions, and many governments, organizations, and ordinary people believed that even small progress could reduce tension. But when the talks ended without a clear agreement, many listeners and readers asked the same question, which is why did these peace talks fail?
And Adam, I think it is important to say clearly to our listeners that feeling confused about this topic is completely normal, because international negotiations are complicated even for experts. And for English learners, the challenge is even bigger, because information comes with long explanations, formal vocabulary, and indirect language. And this is why today's episode is designed to slow everything down, explain ideas step by step, and help listeners understand not only what happened, but also how English is used to describe diplomatic situations in a neutral and professional way.
That is a very important point, Julia. And before we go deeper, it may help learners to understand why peace talks matter far beyond the countries involved. Because when two large nations with strong military capabilities are in conflict, the effects often spread across borders through trade disruption, refugee movements, political alliances, and economic uncertainty. And this means that countries in Europe, Asia, Africa, and even the Americas closely watch these discussions. Not because they want to take sides, but because stability in one region often supports stability in others. And by learning how these connections are explained in English, listeners improve both their global awareness and their language skills at the same time.
Many learners may also wonder why expectations were so high before these talks began. And the reason is that peace negotiations are usually the result of long diplomatic preparation, behind-the-scenes communication, and pressure from international partners who hope to reduce suffering and uncertainty. And when officials announce talks publicly, it often signals that both sides believe discussion is better than silence. But what learners should understand is that agreeing to talk does not automatically mean agreeing on solutions. And this difference is very important in both international relations and English comprehension.
Exactly. And this episode will help listeners understand that peace talks are not a single meeting where everything is decided, but a process filled with disagreements, trust issues, and difficult compromises. And when negotiations fail, it does not always mean that peace is impossible, but rather that the conditions, expectations, or demands of each side remain too far apart. And by hearing these ideas explained in clear English, you will become more comfortable with how journalists and analysts describe complex outcomes without emotional language or political persuasion.
I also want to encourage our listeners not to feel discouraged if some ideas sound new or unfamiliar at first, because learning English through real global topics is one of the best ways to build strong listening skills. And during this podcast, Adam and I will repeat key ideas using different words, explain difficult terms carefully, and show how long sentences are structured in formal spoken English. And this method helps your ears adjust to natural speed and professional vocabulary used in documentaries, interviews, and international news programs.
Before we continue, may I kindly ask our listeners for a small moment of support. And that is, if you find the English Globe helpful for your English learning journey, please like this episode and subscribe to the channel, because your support allows us to continue producing long, educational, and policy-safe content that focuses on language development rather than political opinion. And our goal is always to help learners practice English alone at home while understanding the world in a calm, respectful, and responsible way that follows YouTube's educational guidelines.
Yes, Adam, we truly appreciate every listener who supports this channel. And now let us return to today's main question. Because understanding why no deal was reached requires us to look at expectations, disagreements, and the reality of diplomacy. And this topic is especially useful for English learners because it teaches cause and effect language, comparison structures, and formal expressions like on the one hand and on the other hand, which are commonly used when explaining complex international issues.
In today's journey, Julia and I will guide you carefully through the background of the Ukraine-Russia peace talks, the goals of each side, the main obstacles that prevented agreement, and the broader international context. And while doing this, we will focus on clear pronunciation, long explanatory sentences, and useful vocabulary that appears frequently in global media. And by listening attentively, you will not only understand why these talks did not lead to a deal, but also feel more confident the next time you hear similar discussions in English.
So, dear listeners, relax, take your time, and remember that this podcast is designed to help you learn, not to test you. And by staying with us through this long introduction, you are already training your listening patience, your vocabulary recognition, and your ability to follow structured explanations. And we are very happy to have you with us today on the English Globe. And now let us slowly begin by exploring the background and expectations behind the Ukraine-Russia peace talks and why the world was watching so closely.
To understand why Ukraine and Russia eventually reached the stage of peace talks, it is important for English learners to first understand the background of the conflict in a calm and simple way. Because this situation did not begin suddenly, but developed over many years through political disagreements, security concerns, and historical connections. And while we will not go into every detail, we will focus only on the key points that help you understand why diplomacy became necessary and why talks were seen as an option by the international community.
Yes, Adam. And I think many listeners appreciate this slow explanation, because when people hear about conflicts in the news, they often feel lost, especially when reporters mention past events very quickly, so I hope you can explain the background in a way that helps learners follow the story without feeling overwhelmed by dates, names, or complicated political terms.
Of course, Julia, and let us begin by saying that Ukraine and Russia share a long and complex history, because for many years, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and after the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine became an independent country, which meant it began making its own political and economic decisions, and over time, Ukraine started building closer relationships with European countries, while Russia viewed this movement with concern because it felt that changes near its borders could affect its own security and influence in the region.
So if I understand correctly, Adam, the tension did not start because of one single event, but because of long-term changes in Ukraine's political direction and Russia's reaction to those changes. And this is important for learners to remember because conflicts often grow slowly before they become serious enough to appear in global headlines.
That is exactly right, Julia. And as these tensions increased, disagreements became more visible through political disputes, economic pressure, and military activity, which slowly turned the relationship between the two countries into one of distrust rather than cooperation. And when trust is lost between governments, communication becomes harder, misunderstandings grow, and the risk of conflict increases, which is why many international observers later believed that dialogue would eventually be necessary to prevent further escalation.
And Adam, when we hear the word escalation in English news, it usually means that a situation is becoming more serious or more dangerous. So learners should remember that this word is often used when conflicts move from political disagreement to military action or stronger threats.
Exactly, Julia. And as the conflict intensified, its effects were not limited to Ukraine and Russia alone, because global food supply chains, energy markets, and regional security arrangements were also affected. And when a conflict begins to influence the lives of people far beyond the battlefield, international organizations and foreign governments often feel pressure to respond, which is one of the main reasons why diplomatic efforts started to increase.
So this is where international pressure comes in, right, Adam? Because other countries and organizations do not want instability to spread, and they prefer peaceful solutions that protect trade, security, and human lives.
Yes, Julia, and international pressure can take many forms, such as public statements calling for dialogue, private diplomatic messages encouraging compromise, economic measures designed to push parties toward negotiation, and mediation offers from neutral countries or institutions. And all of these actions aim to bring opposing sides to the table, even when they strongly disagree, because talking is often seen as better than continued confrontation.
That makes sense, and for English learners it is helpful to notice how polite and indirect language is often used in diplomacy. Because instead of demanding something directly, officials usually say they encourage dialogue, support negotiations, or urge restraint, which are softer expressions commonly heard in international English.
Very well said, Julia. And as pressure increased and costs grew higher for both sides, peace talks became a topic of discussion, because negotiations offered a possible way to reduce tension, manage risks, and communicate demands more clearly. And while agreeing to talk does not mean agreeing to peace, it does show that both sides recognize the limits of force and the potential value of diplomacy at that moment.
So, Adam, when peace talks were proposed, many people around the world felt hopeful because they believed that even small agreements, such as humanitarian pauses or communication channels, could lead to better outcomes later. And this explains why expectations were high, even before any results were announced.
Yes, Julia, and this hope was strengthened by the involvement of international mediators, who often act as bridges between opposing sides, helping them communicate, reduce misunderstandings, and explore possible compromises. And for learners, it is important to understand that mediators do not decide outcomes, but instead guide discussions and help keep talks organized and respectful.
I think this is an important point, Adam, because many learners assume that powerful countries or organizations can simply force peace. But in reality, negotiations depend on willingness, trust, and shared interests. And without these elements, talks can easily stall or fail.
That is correct, Julia, and this background helps us understand why peace talks were proposed, but also why reaching a final deal was extremely difficult. Because when positions are far apart and trust is low, discussions become slow and complicated. And in the next sections of this podcast, we will explore these challenges in more detail using clear English and practical explanations.
So, dear listeners, if you feel that this background explanation helped you understand the situation more clearly, remember that learning English through global topics takes time and patience. And by listening carefully to how Adam explains events step by step, you are training yourself to follow long explanations, identify key ideas, and understand how cause and effect are described in formal spoken English.
Exactly, Julia. And as we move forward, keep in mind that this podcast is designed to build understanding gradually. And now that we have explained how the conflict developed and why peace talks became an option, we are ready to explore what peace talks really mean, how they usually work, and why they are often much more complicated than they first appear. Now that we have explained how the conflict developed and why diplomacy became necessary, it is the right moment to clearly explain what peace talks actually mean, because this phrase appears very often in international news, but many English learners are not fully sure how these talks work in real life, and in simple terms, peace talks are organized discussions between opposing sides who are in conflict, where the goal is not to argue loudly or blame each other, but to communicate demands, reduce misunderstandings, and search for solutions that can stop violence or prevent the situation from becoming worse.
That explanation already feels clearer, Adam, because many learners imagine peace talks as one short meeting where leaders shake hands and everything ends happily. But from what you are saying, it sounds more like a long process rather than a single event. And I think it would really help listeners if you could explain this process using simple examples from everyday life.
That is a great idea, Julia. And a useful way to understand peace talks is to compare them to a serious disagreement between two people who must continue living or working together. Because when trust is broken and emotions are strong, one conversation is rarely enough to fix everything, and instead, people often need many calm discussions, sometimes with a third person helping them communicate. And in international relations, this third person is often a mediator, such as another country or an international organization, whose role is to help both sides talk without shouting and without walking away.
So if I understand correctly, Adam, peace talks are not about forcing someone to accept a decision, but about creating a space where communication becomes possible again. And for English learners, this idea is important because words like negotiation and dialogue suggest cooperation rather than confrontation.
Exactly, Julia. And the word negotiation in English means a discussion where each side tries to reach an agreement by giving and receiving something, which is why peace talks are often slow, because both sides must decide what they are willing to accept and what they are not willing to change. And this process takes time, especially when the issues involve territory, security, or national identity, which are very sensitive topics for any country.
I think this is where many learners become confused because they see news headlines saying talks failed or talks stalled, and they may think this means the talks were useless. But from your explanation, it sounds like delays and difficulties are actually normal in diplomatic discussions.
You are absolutely right, Julia, and this is a very important learning point, because in diplomacy, progress is often slow and invisible, and sometimes the most important results are not written in headlines, but happen quietly behind closed doors, such as agreements on communication channels, humanitarian access, or future meetings, and these small steps may not end a conflict immediately, but they can prevent misunderstandings and reduce the risk of sudden escalation.
That makes a lot of sense, and for learners, it is helpful to notice how careful language is used in these situations. Because instead of saying talks failed completely, journalists often say talks made limited progress or talks remain ongoing, which shows how English uses soft expressions to describe sensitive situations.
Yes, Julia, and another important question learners often ask is who actually participates in peace talks, because it is not always just presidents or prime ministers sitting at a table, and in many cases peace talks include diplomats, military advisors, legal experts, and representatives from international organizations, all of whom bring different knowledge and responsibilities, and this helps ensure that discussions are detailed, realistic, and connected to real-world consequences.
So, Adam, when we hear about delegations in the news, this means a group of people representing a country, not just one leader, and learners should understand that delegation is a key word in international English that describes official representatives sent to negotiate.
Exactly, Julia. And delegations are important because they allow talks to continue even when top leaders are not present. And this is another reason peace talks take a long time, because decisions often need approval from governments, legal review, and coordination with allies, and nothing can be finalized quickly without careful planning, which helps avoid mistakes that could create new problems later.
I think learners will find this explanation very helpful, because it shows that diplomacy is more about patience and structure than drama. And it also explains why news reports sometimes feel repetitive, because similar meetings happen again and again before any agreement is reached.
That is true, Julia. And patience is one of the most important skills in peace talks, because trust does not return quickly once it has been damaged, and negotiators must slowly test whether promises will be respected, which is why confidence-building measures are often discussed, such as temporary ceasefires or monitoring systems, and these measures help both sides feel safer before moving toward bigger agreements.
So, confidence-building measures are small steps designed to reduce fear. And for English learners, this phrase is very useful, because it appears often in reports about conflict resolution and international diplomacy.
Yes, Julia. And another reason peace talks take time is that each side speaks not only for itself, but also for its people, allies, and future interests, which means negotiators must think carefully before agreeing to anything, because decisions made at the table can affect generations, and this responsibility makes leaders cautious, slow, and sometimes unwilling to compromise quickly.
This explanation really helps learners understand why saying no deal was reached does not always mean talks were meaningless, but instead shows how complicated decision-making can be at the international level.
Exactly, Julia. And that understanding is very important for English learners, because it allows them to read and listen to global news with more patience and realism. And instead of expecting fast solutions, they learn to recognize patterns, repeated discussions, and careful wording, which are key features of formal international English.
Dear listeners, if you are finding this section useful, remember that learning English is not only about grammar rules, but also about understanding how ideas are expressed in real contexts. And peace talks are a perfect example of how language is used carefully to manage expectations, reduce tension, and keep communication open, even in difficult situations.
Well said, Julia. And as we move forward in this podcast, keep in mind that peace talks are a process, not a moment, and understanding this concept will help you follow the next sections more easily, where we will look at what each side wanted, what disagreements remained, and why reaching a final deal was so challenging in this particular case.
So take a deep breath, stay relaxed, and continue listening with curiosity, because by following these long explanations, you are training your ears, expanding your vocabulary, and becoming more confident in understanding serious global discussions in English. And now that we understand what peace talks are and how they normally work, we are ready to explore the goals and expectations behind the Ukraine-Russia negotiations.
To understand why the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia were so difficult, it is very important for English learners to clearly understand Ukraine's main goals, because in diplomacy, each side enters negotiations with specific concerns and priorities, and Ukraine's position can be explained calmly and factually by focusing on three key ideas, which are security, territorial integrity, and international guarantees. And by learning these concepts in simple English, listeners can better follow how governments explain their positions in global discussions.
Adam, before you go deeper, I think it would help learners if you explain what security concerns mean in this context, because this phrase appears very often in international news, but many people are not fully sure how to understand it.
That is a very good question, Julia. And in simple terms, security concerns refer to worries about safety, protection, and the risk of future attacks. And for Ukraine, this means ensuring that its people, cities, and infrastructure are protected from further military action, because when a country experiences conflict, one of its strongest priorities becomes preventing that situation from happening again, and this explains why security was at the center of Ukraine's position during the peace talks.
So if I understand correctly, Adam, Ukraine was not only thinking about stopping current fighting, but also about avoiding similar dangers in the future. And this long-term thinking is something learners should notice when listening to diplomatic language.
Exactly, Julia. And this long-term thinking leads us to the second key goal, which is territorial integrity. And this is a very important phrase in international law and diplomacy, because territorial integrity means that a country believes its borders should remain whole and unchanged, and that no part of its land should be taken or controlled by another state without consent. And Ukraine has consistently stated that protecting its internationally recognized borders is a central principle in any peace discussion.
Territorial integrity is definitely an important keyword, Adam. And for learners, it may help to remember that integrity in English often means being complete or whole. So territorial integrity means keeping the country complete without losing land.
That is a very helpful way to remember it, Julia, and Ukraine's focus on territorial integrity is closely connected to international rules that many countries follow. Because if borders are changed through force, it can create uncertainty and fear for other nations as well, and this is why Ukraine often explains its position not only as a national issue, but also as a matter of international stability and legal principles.
So, Adam, does this mean that Ukraine wanted peace talks to clearly respect existing borders, and that this issue made negotiations more difficult?
Yes, Julia, and this is one of the reasons why peace talks became complicated, because when territorial questions are involved, compromise becomes much harder, as land is not just a physical space, but also connected to identity, history, and sovereignty, and Ukraine's position emphasized that peace should not come at the cost of losing control over its territory.
I think learners will find this explanation very useful because it shows how diplomatic language often avoids emotional expressions, but still communicates very firm positions using formal terms like sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Exactly, Julia. And now let us move to the third major goal, which is international guarantees. And this phrase may sound complex at first, but its meaning can be explained simply, because international guarantees refer to promises or commitments made by other countries or organizations to help protect Ukraine's security in the future. And these guarantees are meant to reduce fear and increase trust after a conflict.
So, Adam, when Ukraine talks about international guarantees, does this mean it wants support or protection from other countries if problems happen again?
Yes, Julia. That is a clear and learner-friendly way to understand it, and these guarantees can include diplomatic support, economic assistance, or security arrangements designed to discourage future aggression. And for Ukraine, such guarantees are important because trust between the two main sides is very low, and outside involvement is seen as a way to add stability and reassurance.
I think this is a very important point for English learners, because the word guarantee in everyday English often means a promise, and in international relations it carries a similar meaning, but on a much larger and more serious scale.
That is correct, Julia. And Ukraine's focus on guarantees shows that peace talks are not only about ending current fighting, but also about creating conditions for long-term peace. And without clear assurances, any agreement may feel temporary or fragile, which is why Ukraine consistently raised this issue during negotiations.
So, Adam, if we put these ideas together, Ukraine's goals were mainly about safety, keeping its land whole, and making sure future peace would be supported by the international community. And this helps learners see that Ukraine's position was structured and based on clear priorities rather than emotional reactions.
Exactly, Julia. And presenting goals in this structured way is very common in diplomacy, because governments try to explain their positions using legal language, security reasoning, and international norms. And for English learners, this is an excellent opportunity to observe how formal arguments are built calmly and logically in global discussions.
I would also like to remind listeners to pay attention to how these keywords are repeated, because repetition is common in international speeches, and words like security, territorial integrity, and guarantees are used again and again to make positions clear and consistent.
That is an excellent learning tip, Julia. And repetition helps both negotiators and language learners because it reinforces key ideas and reduces misunderstanding. And as we continue this podcast, keep these 3 goals in mind because they help explain why reaching a deal was so difficult and why compromises were not easy to achieve.
Dear listeners, do not worry if these ideas still feel a little heavy, because understanding international positions takes time. And by listening to these explanations slowly, you are training yourself to understand serious English content that appears in news reports, interviews, and documentaries.
Very well said, Julia. And now that we have clearly explained Ukraine's main goals in the peace talks, we are ready to move forward and explore the other side's position with the same calm, neutral, and educational approach, which will help you compare ideas, understand differences, and improve your English comprehension step by step. To understand why the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia did not lead to a final agreement, English learners must also clearly understand Russia's main goals, because peace negotiations always involve at least 2 different perspectives, and Russia's position can be explained calmly and factually by focusing on security demands, strategic concerns, and political interests, without using emotional language or political judgment. And this balanced explanation helps learners see how international discussions present national priorities in a formal and structured way, rather than through opinions or personal feelings.
Adam, I think it is very helpful that you are explaining this calmly, because many learners feel nervous when listening to news about powerful countries. So could you first explain Russia's security demands in simple English, and also help listeners understand why governments often talk about security as their top concern in peace talks?
That is an excellent question, Julia. And in simple terms, Russia's security demands are connected to its concern about military activity near its borders, because countries often feel safer when surrounding regions are stable and predictable, and Russia has repeatedly stated that changes in military balance close to its territory create fear and uncertainty, which is why during peace talks it focused strongly on limiting perceived threats, reducing military pressure nearby, and gaining assurances that future arrangements would not weaken its own sense of national security.
So if I understand correctly, Adam, Russia's security demands are not only about current fighting, but also about how the region might look in the future. And this future-focused thinking is important for learners to notice, because diplomatic language often looks many years ahead, rather than only at today's situation.
Exactly, Julia. And this leads us naturally to Russia's strategic concerns, which are closely related to long-term planning and influence, because strategy in international relations means thinking about geography, alliances, and balance of power, and Russia has expressed concern about losing strategic depth, meaning the physical and political space that it believes helps protect its territory. And during peace talks, it tried to address these concerns by seeking arrangements that would limit sudden changes in the regional security environment.
Strategic concerns can sound like a difficult phrase, but for learners it may help to think of strategy as a long-term plan. So Russia's strategic concerns are about how decisions made today could affect its position tomorrow. And this way of thinking is common in formal international English.
That is a very clear explanation, Julia. And another important part of Russia's position involves political and regional interests, because governments do not negotiate only about safety, but also about influence, recognition, and relationships with neighboring countries. And Russia has emphasized the importance of maintaining a strong role in its surrounding region, protecting what it sees as its political interests, and ensuring that any peace agreement reflects its status and role within the wider international system.
I think learners will benefit from hearing this explained slowly, because political and regional interests can sound abstract. But in simple terms, they mean how a country wants to be seen, how much influence it has nearby, and how it interacts with other states. And these ideas often appear in news reports using very formal language.
Yes, Julia. And it is also important to understand that Russia's goals were presented through official statements and diplomatic language, which often avoids strong emotional expressions, and instead uses terms like stability, balance, and mutual respect. And by listening carefully to this kind of language, English learners can train themselves to recognize how governments communicate firm positions while still sounding calm and professional.
So, Adam, when learners hear that Russia demanded guarantees or assurances, they should understand this as part of a broader effort to reduce uncertainty and protect its interests, rather than as a simple or one-dimensional demand, and this helps listeners avoid oversimplified interpretations.
That is absolutely right, Julia. And another reason Russia's goals complicated the peace talks is that strategic and security demands often require trust, and trust was already very low, which made it difficult for either side to accept promises without strong verification mechanisms. And this explains why discussions became slow and detailed, as negotiators tried to translate broad concerns into specific terms that could be written into possible agreements.
For English learners, this part is very important because it shows why talks can continue for weeks or months without visible results. And it also explains why news articles often mention phrases like stalled negotiations or unresolved differences, which simply mean that the sides could not yet agree on how to meet each other's core demands.
Exactly, Julia. And when we look at Russia's position as a whole, we can see that its goals were structured around protecting security, maintaining strategic influence, and preserving political interests in the region, and understanding this structure allows learners to compare positions objectively without taking sides, and to improve their ability to understand international debates presented in English-language media.
Dear listeners, as you listen to these explanations, remember that learning English through global topics is about understanding how ideas are expressed, not about choosing who is right or wrong. And by following Adam's calm explanations, you are building the skill of listening to complex arguments while focusing on language, vocabulary, and meaning.
Well said, Julia. And now that we have clearly and neutrally explained Russia's main goals in the peace talks, we are ready to move forward and examine where the biggest disagreements appeared, because only by understanding both sides' priorities can learners fully grasp why no final deal was reached and why diplomacy in such situations is extremely challenging. Now that we have carefully explained the main goals of both Ukraine and Russia, it becomes easier to understand why the peace talks did not result in a final agreement, because the biggest obstacles were not small misunderstandings, but deep disagreements related to territory, security guarantees, and trust. And these three issues are closely connected, meaning that when one problem could not be solved, it made the other problems even more difficult. And for English learners, this section is important because it shows how complex disagreements are explained step by step in formal international English.
Adam, I think many learners want to ask a very simple question here, which is why territory became such a strong problem in the talks. Because from the outside, it may seem like borders are just lines on a map, so could you explain why territorial issues are so sensitive and difficult to compromise on?
That is a very good question, Julia, and the reason territory causes such strong disagreement is that land is not only about geography, but also about sovereignty, identity, and legal recognition. And for Ukraine, territorial integrity means keeping internationally recognized borders unchanged, while for Russia, territorial questions are connected to security and strategic influence, and when two sides define the same land in very different ways, it becomes extremely hard to reach a shared solution that both can accept without feeling they are losing something essential.
So if I understand correctly, Adam, the territorial issue was not just about control of land, but about how each side understands law, history, and national rights. And this makes compromise much harder than in simple economic disagreements.
Exactly, Julia. And this is why territorial questions often become the longest and most difficult part of peace talks. Because once borders are discussed, negotiators must consider international law, public opinion at home, and long-term consequences. and agreeing to changes can create political pressure inside a country, which makes leaders cautious and unwilling to make fast decisions during negotiations.
That explanation helps a lot, Adam, and it also explains why news reports often say that territorial issues remain unresolved. Because unresolved simply means that no shared solution could be found that satisfied both sides.
Yes, Julia, and closely connected to territory is the second major disagreement, which is security guarantees. Because even if fighting stops, both sides worry about what might happen in the future, and Ukraine wanted strong international guarantees to prevent future attacks, while Russia wanted assurances that future security arrangements would not threaten its own safety. And when both sides demand guarantees but do not trust each other, negotiations become extremely complicated.
Why is trust so important here, Adam? Because learners often hear about guarantees, agreements, and promises. But it sounds like these words only matter if both sides believe them.
That is exactly right, Julia. Because a guarantee is only effective if the side receiving it believes it will be respected. And in this case, trust was very low due to past experiences, ongoing conflict, and broken expectations, which meant that promises alone were not enough, and both sides wanted strong enforcement mechanisms, verification systems, or outside involvement, all of which added new layers of disagreement to the talks.
So for learners, it is important to understand that when trust is missing, even reasonable proposals can be rejected, not because they are bad ideas, but because the sides fear they will not be respected in reality.
Yes, Julia, and this brings us to the third and perhaps most serious obstacle, which is the overall trust problem between both sides, because trust is the foundation of any negotiation, and when trust disappears, every statement is questioned, every proposal is examined with suspicion, and even small misunderstandings can slow progress, and this environment makes peace talks very slow and emotionally difficult, even when negotiators try to remain calm and professional.
I think learners will find this very relatable, Adam, because even in everyday life, when trust is broken between two people, conversations become tense and slow, and this simple comparison helps explain why international peace talks can take months or even years.
That is a very helpful comparison, Julia, and in diplomacy, this lack of trust leads to repeated discussions, requests for clarification, and demands for written commitments. And while this process is necessary to avoid future conflict, it also explains why peace talks often end without a deal, because the sides cannot reach the level of confidence needed to accept major compromises.
So when learners hear that talks collapsed or talks ended without agreement, they should understand that this usually means the sides could not overcome these deep disagreements, rather than that discussions were pointless or meaningless.
Exactly, Julia. And this understanding helps English learners follow international news more realistically, because instead of expecting fast solutions, they learn to recognize that peace is a long process shaped by history, fear, and conflicting priorities. And by listening to how these disagreements are explained in clear English, learners improve both their language skills and their global awareness.
Dear listeners, as you listen to this section, remember that your goal is not to judge the situation, but to understand how complex problems are explained calmly in English. And by hearing Adam break down each disagreement step by step, you are training yourself to understand structured explanations, cause and effect language, and formal vocabulary used in serious global discussions.
Very well said, Julia. And now that we have clearly explained the main disagreements that blocked the deal, we are ready to move forward and examine how other countries and international organizations became involved, because external actors also play an important role in shaping peace talks and influencing their outcomes. When people hear the words peace talks, they often imagine two countries sitting alone at a table, but in reality, modern conflicts almost always involve many other countries and international organizations working quietly in the background, because wars today affect trade, energy, food prices, refugees, and global security, which means the international community cannot simply watch and stay silent. And this is why peace talks usually become a large diplomatic process where mediators, observers, guarantors, and international institutions all try to influence the direction of negotiations without directly fighting in the conflict themselves.
For English learners, it is important to understand the keyword international involvement, which means other countries or groups take part indirectly, not as fighters, but as helpers. And you can think of it like a group of neighbors trying to stop a fight between two families, because even if the neighbors are not fighting, the noise, danger, and damage affect everyone living nearby, so they step in to calm the situation and protect the whole community.
One of the most important organizations in this process is the United Nations, often called the UN, which was created after World War II with the main goal of preventing large global conflicts. And in peace talks, the UN usually acts as a neutral platform where discussions can happen, resolutions can be proposed, humanitarian aid can be organized, and ceasefires can be monitored, even though it does not have the power to force peace, because its influence depends on cooperation from member countries.
A useful word here is neutral, which means not taking sides. And learners should remember that the UN tries to speak carefully so it can talk to all sides at the same time, because if it openly supports one side, it may lose trust from the other. And without trust, peace talks become much harder, just like a teacher cannot solve an argument between students if one student feels the teacher is unfair from the beginning.
Another major role in peace talks is played by powerful countries such as the United States and countries in Europe, not because they are directly part of the conflict, but because they have economic strength, political influence, and long diplomatic experience, which allows them to apply pressure through sanctions, offer incentives like financial support, or provide security promises, all of which can push the conflicting sides closer to negotiation instead of continued fighting.
For learners, the word pressure does not always mean violence or force, because in diplomacy it often means using money, trade, or political relationships to influence behavior. And a good way to understand this is to imagine a company that changes its behavior because customers stop buying its products, which shows how influence can be strong even without physical force.
European countries, especially those close to the conflict region, also play a special role because they may face direct consequences such as refugee flows, energy shortages, and economic instability, so their involvement in peace talks is often motivated by practical concerns rather than ideology, as stability in neighboring regions helps protect their own societies, economies, and political systems from long-term disruption.
A key phrase here is regional stability, which means keeping peace and balance in a specific area of the world. And learners can connect this to real life by thinking about how peace in one neighborhood affects nearby neighborhoods, because problems rarely stay in one place, and instability often spreads if it is not managed early.
International mediation matters because it creates communication channels when direct talks between the two sides break down, as mediators can carry messages, clarify misunderstandings, and suggest compromise solutions that neither side wants to propose publicly, and this behind-the-scenes work is often slow, quiet, and invisible, but it can prevent small disagreements from turning into permanent barriers.
The word mediation is very important for learners, and it means helping two sides talk to each other without forcing a decision, similar to a counselor helping two people understand each other's concerns, and this process requires patience, careful language, and a deep understanding of culture, history, and political fears on both sides.
Another reason international organizations matter is humanitarian concern, because during long conflicts, civilians suffer from shortages of food, medicine, and safe shelter, and organizations working with or under the UN often use peace talks to secure humanitarian corridors, temporary ceasefires, or agreements that allow aid to reach people in need, even when full peace is still far away.
For learners, humanitarian aid means help, given to protect human life and dignity, not to support one side politically. And understanding this difference is essential, because it explains why even countries that disagree politically can still cooperate to deliver food or medical assistance during peace negotiations.
In the end, the role of other countries and international organizations shows that modern conflicts are global issues, not isolated events, and peace talks become a complex network of discussions, pressures, compromises, and long-term planning, where success depends not only on the two main sides, but also on how responsibly the wider international community supports dialogue instead of escalation.
For English learners listening to this podcast, the key takeaway is that peace talks are like a large team effort, where many actors play different roles. And by understanding these roles and the vocabulary around them, you not only improve your English skills, but also gain a clearer, calmer, and more balanced understanding of how global politics connects directly to everyday life around the world.
Many people around the world ask a simple and very human question. If everyone says they want peace, then why do peace talks fail so often? This question appears in almost every global conflict, and the answer is not usually about one dramatic moment or one bad decision, but about repeated patterns that we see again and again in international politics, where fear, history, pressure, and uncertainty slowly weaken negotiations, even when leaders publicly say they want to stop the fighting and move toward a peaceful solution.
For English learners, this is a good place to learn the word pattern, which means something that happens again and again in similar situations, and you can think of it like arguments between people in everyday life. Because sometimes both sides want to fix the relationship, but the same problems keep coming back, not because people love conflict, but because trust is already damaged.
One of the biggest reasons peace talks fail is trust, or more accurately, the lack of trust. Because when countries have fought each other, broken agreements, or accused each other of lies in the past, every promise made at the negotiating table is questioned, and leaders often worry that if they make a compromise today, the other side may use it against them tomorrow, which makes even small agreements feel risky and dangerous.
Trust is a simple word but a very powerful one. And learners should remember that trust means believing that the other side will do what they say, and just like in friendships or marriages, once trust is broken, rebuilding it takes a long time, patience, and many small actions, not just one big speech or one signed document.
Another major reason peace talks fail is that countries have different national interests, which means they want different outcomes based on their own security, economy, history, and political goals. And even if both sides say they want peace, they may imagine very different versions of what peace looks like, making it hard to find a solution that feels fair and safe for everyone involved.
A helpful phrase here is national interest, which means what a country believes is best for its own future. And learners can relate to this by thinking about two people sharing an apartment, because both want a peaceful home, but one wants silence and the other wants music. So peace means different things to different people.
Timing also plays a critical role in the success or failure of peace talks, because negotiations often happen while fighting is still ongoing. Emotions are high, and public pressure is intense, which makes leaders afraid of appearing weak in front of their citizens, military, or political opponents. And this fear can push them to delay compromises even when they privately believe negotiation is the right path.
The word pressure is very important here, and it does not only come from other countries, but also from voters, media, and political rivals at home. And learners can connect this to real life by imagining how hard it is to apologize during an argument when other people are watching and judging every word you say.
Political pressure inside a country can be just as strong as pressure from outside, because leaders must think about elections, public opinion, and national pride, and sometimes continuing talks becomes politically dangerous, even if stopping them leads to more suffering, which shows how peace is not only a moral issue, but also a political calculation.
A useful term here is public opinion, which means what most people in a country think or feel about an issue. And learners should understand that leaders often act differently in private meetings than they do in public speeches because they are constantly balancing honesty with survival in politics.
Peace talks also fail because conflicts are rarely only about one issue, as they usually involve territory, security, identity, history, and future influence all at the same time, which makes negotiations extremely complex, since solving one problem does not automatically solve the others, and sometimes progress in one area creates new disagreements in another.
This complexity can feel confusing, and learners can think of it like trying to fix a broken car, where repairing the engine does not fix the brakes, and fixing the brakes does not repair the steering. So peace talks often move slowly because many problems must be addressed together.
Finally, peace talks often fail not because people hate peace, but because peace requires compromise, patience, and long-term thinking, which are difficult qualities to maintain during conflict, especially when fear and uncertainty dominate decision-making. And this lesson applies to many global conflicts, showing us that wanting peace is only the first step, not the final solution.
For English learners listening today, the main lesson is that peace talks fail for human reasons, not just political ones. And by understanding words like trust, pressure, interests, and timing, you gain both better English skills and a deeper understanding of why solving conflicts, whether between countries or between people, is one of the hardest challenges in the world.
Even when peace talks do not produce an agreement, it is important for learners to understand that failure does not mean the end of negotiation or the start of permanent war, because in most modern conflicts, talks are part of a long process, and failure simply shows that the sides could not yet resolve deep disagreements. And this is very normal in international diplomacy, where history, trust, security, and political pressure all combine to slow down progress. And for English learners, understanding the steps that follow a failed negotiation helps improve both your vocabulary and your comprehension of real-world international reporting in a calm and structured way.
Yes, Adam, and I want listeners to know that when peace talks fail, it does not mean chaos or hopelessness, because most countries continue some form of negotiation, sometimes quietly behind the scenes, and other times through smaller agreements on humanitarian aid, ceasefires, or technical arrangements. And this shows that diplomacy is a process, not a single moment. And learners should pay attention to words like continuing negotiations, interim agreements, and dialogue, because these phrases appear frequently in English language news about conflicts around the world.
A common outcome after failed talks is that both sides often return to the table with new proposals, adjustments, or concessions, because even small changes in strategy, leadership, or international pressure can create new opportunities for progress. And while the public may perceive failure as final, the reality is that peace negotiations are iterative, which means they happen step by step over time. And understanding this iterative process is important for learners because it explains why news articles might report that talks will resume even after weeks or months of apparent stalemate, and the language used often reflects cautious optimism rather than drama.
For learners, it is very helpful to understand the phrase iterative process, because it simply means repeating steps, learning from each attempt, and gradually moving forward, just like practicing English itself, where repeated effort improves understanding over time, and by seeing this connection, learners can feel more confident applying patience and careful listening to both language learning and understanding international news.
Another important effect after failed peace talks is economic and humanitarian, because ongoing conflict, even without escalation, continues to disrupt markets, trade, and resources, and civilians often feel the consequences, most directly through shortages of food, medicine, and safe housing. And this is why many countries and organizations focus on emergency aid, temporary agreements, and indirect support, while full peace remains uncertain. And learners should notice that in international English, phrases like humanitarian impact, economic pressure, and emergency aid are often used to describe these consequences in calm, factual language rather than emotional or sensational terms.
Exactly, Adam. And I want to emphasize to learners that hearing about humanitarian and economic effects should not create fear, because the news is often neutral and factual. And by listening carefully, learners can practice how English describes serious problems without dramatizing them. And you can connect these words to everyday life by thinking about how a city recovers after a storm or flood, which helps your mind understand cause and effect language in a real-world context.
Even after failed talks, the possibility of future negotiations remains open because both sides often hope for conditions to improve, such as reduced tensions, better international guarantees, or changes in leadership or public opinion. And these changes can create a new window for dialogue. And for English learners, this teaches the word possibility, which indicates that outcomes are not fixed, and the language of cautious hope is very common in news, academic writing, and diplomatic statements, allowing learners to recognize subtle differences between certainty and potential in formal English.
It is also important for learners to understand that continued dialogue can take many forms, not always in the same room or city, because diplomats, mediators, and international organizations often communicate through letters, virtual meetings, or intermediary countries. And this shows that communication in international relations is flexible, multi-layered, and ongoing. And hearing these explanations repeatedly helps learners understand long sentences, formal connectors like because, even though, and while, and complex sentence structures that are typical in global English discussions. For learners, this is a great example of how formal English communicates complicated ideas in one sentence without making it emotional, because a dual-track approach simply means managing two activities at the same time. And by understanding this metaphorical language, listeners can improve both comprehension and vocabulary for professional or academic contexts.
Finally, it is important to emphasize that failed talks do not necessarily mean that future peace is impossible, because history shows that many agreements were reached only after multiple rounds of negotiation, repeated compromise, and incremental trust building. And this is an encouraging lesson for learners, because it illustrates that patience, persistence, and structured dialogue are key both in diplomacy and in language learning. And by listening to these long, carefully explained sections, learners train their ears to follow complex ideas, long sentences, and formal expressions without feeling lost or overwhelmed.
Yes, Adam and I want to reassure listeners that the purpose of this discussion is educational and calm. And by understanding the consequences of failed peace talks, learners improve their comprehension of global news, vocabulary related to negotiation, and confidence in listening to long formal English discussions. And you should remember that language learning, like diplomacy, is a process that takes time, repetition, and patience. And every sentence you hear in these podcasts helps you develop skills to understand, analyze, and discuss serious international topics in English with growing confidence.
Well said, Julia. And now that we have clearly explained what happens after failed peace talks, including continued negotiations, economic and humanitarian consequences, and the possibility of future dialogue, listeners are better prepared to understand that conflict resolution is a slow, structured, and patient process, and that the calm, factual language used by diplomats and international organizations can also serve as a model for learners to improve formal English comprehension, long sentence listening skills, and vocabulary for discussing global events. Dear listeners, as we reach the final section of today's episode, it is important to slowly and carefully summarize the key points we have discussed about the Ukraine-Russia peace talks. because understanding a recap not only reinforces your comprehension of international relations, but also strengthens your English listening skills. And to begin simply, we explained the background of the conflict, including how tensions developed over time, why peace talks were proposed, and the role of history, geography, and politics in shaping both countries' perspectives. And by revisiting these facts in simple English, learners can consolidate vocabulary such as conflict, negotiation, diplomacy, and territorial integrity, which appear frequently in news and academic discussions about international relations.
Yes, Adam. And I want to help learners remember that we also carefully explained the main goals of both Ukraine and Russia during the peace talks, and we emphasized security concerns, strategic interests, political priorities, and national ambitions. And while these concepts may sound complicated at first, we presented them slowly, in formal but simple English, to show how professionals explain positions without bias. And by hearing these words repeatedly, learners can practice understanding long sentences, recognizing connectors such as because, although, while, and even if, and also identifying cause and effect relationships in structured explanations about global politics.
Another key point we discussed was the role of other countries and international organizations, including the United Nations, the United States, and European actors, and we explained how mediation, humanitarian aid, and international pressure support the negotiation process without taking sides or favoring one country. And this shows learners how global diplomacy works in practice and how complex situations are often managed through a combination of dialogue, neutral intervention, and incremental agreements, which also teaches phrases like international involvement, neutral platform, mediation, and humanitarian assistance, which are essential for understanding global news in clear English.
Exactly, Adam. And learners should also remember the section where we explored why peace talks often fail, even when both sides say they want peace, and we highlighted issues such as lack of trust, different national interests, political pressure, and the timing of negotiations, and by comparing these obstacles to everyday human disagreements, learners can connect vocabulary, like trust, interests, pressure, and timing, to real-life situations, which makes abstract diplomatic language easier to understand and remember, and shows how formal English expresses complex reasoning in calm, structured, and professional sentences.
We also explained what happens after failed peace talks, including the continuation of negotiations, ongoing economic and humanitarian effects, and the possibility of future dialogue, and we emphasized that failure does not mean permanent conflict or hopelessness, and learners can observe how English uses cautious language, connectors, and precise vocabulary, such as possibility, iterative process, humanitarian impact, and dual-track approach to describe outcomes factually and neutrally, which reinforces both language comprehension and the ability to follow international news reports that are often long, detailed, and formal in style.
Dear listeners, it is very important for learners to understand that this podcast is completely educational and neutral, and our goal has always been to present complex topics in calm, structured English that can be followed by learners of all levels. And while we discussed sensitive issues involving countries, conflicts, and global diplomacy, we did not promote any political side, opinion, or ideology, and instead focused on vocabulary, sentence structure, cause and effect language, and professional explanations that are safe and suitable for YouTube's educational content policies.
Yes, Julia, and to reinforce this educational purpose, I want learners to remember that listening to long, structured dialogues like this helps you improve your ability to understand formal English, follow complex reasoning, and recognize diplomatic language without becoming confused. And the calm tone, repeated explanations, and step-by-step approach are designed to make even challenging topics accessible, and by practicing active listening, learners strengthen comprehension, retention, and confidence, which are essential skills for reading, writing, and speaking about real-world issues in English.
In addition, I want to encourage all listeners to continue improving your English by listening, repeating, and analyzing long sentences, paying attention to connectors like although, because, even if, and while, and noticing how vocabulary is repeated and explained in different ways. Because this method of slow, deliberate learning is one of the most effective ways to internalize formal and professional English. And by following this approach consistently, you will gradually become comfortable understanding documentaries, news reports, and academic discussions in English without feeling overwhelmed or lost.
Finally, I would like to remind learners that international relations, conflicts, and peace talks are complex topics, and it is natural to feel that some parts are difficult at first. But by listening carefully to explanations, repeating key vocabulary, and focusing on the structure of long sentences, you can gradually understand not only the content, but also the style of professional English. And this is the same approach used in news analysis, diplomatic briefings, and academic English. And by combining comprehension, vocabulary building, and critical thinking, learners can gain both language skills and global awareness in a safe, calm, and educational way.
Dear listeners, as we close today's episode of the English Globe, remember that learning English through real-world topics is not only about language, but also about understanding the world in a structured, neutral, and patient way. And our hope is that you feel motivated, confident, and curious to continue exploring global issues, practicing long listening, and analyzing vocabulary and sentence structures. Because consistent practice leads to improvement, and by keeping a calm, step-by-step approach, you will gradually become more fluent, confident, and capable of following even the most complex English discussions without fear or confusion.
Thank you very much for joining us today, and we sincerely hope that this episode helped you understand the Ukraine-Russia peace talks in simple English, improved your comprehension of international relations, and strengthened your listening skills. And remember that learning English is a journey, just like diplomacy itself, where patience, repetition, and careful observation are key. And with each long podcast, you are building the skills to think, listen, and understand professional English while exploring important global topics in a calm, safe, and educational environment.
Yes, Adam, thank you to all our listeners, and keep practicing, stay curious, and continue learning with confidence, because every moment you spend listening carefully and reflecting on vocabulary, long sentences, and global ideas helps you improve step by step. And we are excited to meet you again in the next episode of the English Globe, where we will explore another fascinating topic in calm, clear, and learner-friendly English.